Masechet Yevamot, Daf Dalid. We've seen that our first Mishnah speaks about not cases where you have to perform Yibbum, but ironically cases where one may not perform Yibbum. And it's because in all these 15 cases, if the Yavam were to do Yibbum with the woman, then it would violate a case of incest. For example, if two brothers are married to two sisters, and then one of the brothers died, that would require the living brother, the Yavam, to marry his wife's sister. And if they are both alive, then that would be its own prohibition. So can one then violate the prohibition of arayot and marry two sisters to perform Yibbum? Well, our Mishnah's answer is no. But how do we know that? What is the source? Oh, the answer is the source was the word aleha. So here we have a contradiction. On the one hand, one pasuk says you have to do Yibbum. That's a positive commandment. Perform Yibbum. On the other hand, we have back in Vayikra the law that one may not be married to two sisters. That's a negative commandment, a prohibition. So these two seem to contradict each other. Which one will override? Will you perform Yibbum and violate the erva law? Or the erva law tells you don't do Yibbum in this case? And the answer is the word aleha appears in both to say that the two sisters prohibition and any other law of incest overrides Yibbum. So you cannot do Yibbum in this case, in any of these cases, and you don't have to do chalitza, not Yibbum. The entire law does not apply. That's everything that we saw yesterday. This gezerah shava is the origin. All right, very good. Now, today we're going to ask, why do we need this law of aleha, this derivation of aleha, to teach me that the prohibition overrides Yibbum? This must assume, why would I think otherwise? In other words, if I just had these two, why would I otherwise assume that Yibbum overrides the prohibition? Maybe the prohibition would anyway override the commandment. And why do I need this word aleha to teach me that the prohibition overrides? We're going to see. The answer is because we assume that otherwise we would apply a general rule that aseh doche lo ta'aseh. A positive commandment in general overrides a negative commandment. This daf is going to be the major source for this rule, which is an important rule. Positive overrides negative. So in general, positive and negative, positive overrides. And if we applied that rule in this case, that would mean Yibbum overrides the laws of incest. And so you do Yibbum, even with any of those relationships, which would be crazy. And that's why we need aleha to say that we override the rule about positive overriding negative. And so here it's the negative that overrides the positive, and you don't do Yibbum. Okay, so that is the aleha and assumes the rule positive overrides negative. For the whole rest of the daf and tomorrow's daf, we are going to analyze this very rule. And we're going to ask two questions. Number one, this rule would not apply in our case anyway, because we don't override if it's a negative commandment that has karet. We say a positive overrides a negative, but not a powerful negative that has karet. And so in our case, we would not assume that the aseh is doche lo ta'aseh. Therefore, we don't even need the aleha. That's question number one that we're not going to answer today. We're not going to answer till the end of the daf tomorrow. But then we have a second question, which is, what is the source of the rule that positive overrides negative? How do you even know? Is it a real rule? What's your source? Maybe it's not a real rule. If it's not a real rule, then I have no reason to assume that the positive would go over the negative, and therefore I don't need aleha to tell me that in this case, the negative overrides the positive. And so the whole daf is going to be the source for the rule that ba'aseh v'doche lo ta'aseh. All right, let's read inside what we just explained. The only reason for all the laws in the Mishnah that we do not perform Yibbum is because of the gezerah shava of aleha, says in both contexts of the sisters and Yibbum, and therefore you do not perform Yibbum when it's going to be a problem of incest with sisters, and therefore any other laws of arayot. If it wasn't for these word aleha, then I would have thought that in a case of my wife's sister, I would do Yibbum and be married to two sisters. Why would I think, right? Why would I think that? Because in general, a positive commandment would override a negative commandment. And so if not for aleha, I would assume that positive commandment of Yibbum overrides the negative commandment of arayot. Okay, good. So that's the statement. Now, question number one. Hold on, we only apply this rule for a regular lo ta'aseh. Lo ta'aseh sheyesh bo karet midache, but if it's a powerful lo ta'aseh that has a punishment of karet, like all of the cases of arayot do, then we has no reason, we would not assume that the positive commandment overrides. The opposite, the negative commandment would override. And therefore, even without the dirasha of aleha, I would assume that a powerful negative commandment like karet would override Yibbum. And so it would be obvious without aleha. That is question number one that we're not going to answer today. We're going to deal with the second question. And even the first rule, even if it would apply, what is your source for that entire rule? If you don't have a source and it's not even a rule, then forget about it. Then for sure, otherwise we would assume a lo ta'aseh would override an aseh, so certainly we don't need the derasha of aleha. Okay, so put that on hold. We're going to go into this tangent of how do we know that a aseh is overrides a lo ta'aseh. And here's the answer. Dichtiv lo tilbash shaatnez gedidim ta'aseh lach. The answer, we're going to deal with this case a lot today. So lo tilbash shaatnez. There's two pisukim back to back. Let me show you the pisukim. Do not wear mixed clothing, which is defined as wool and linen together. Fine, I know that in general, I can't wear Shaatnez. The very next pasuk in Devarim 22 says, Gedidim ta'aseh lach al ba kanfot kesutecha asher techaseh ba. That you have to wear, it doesn't call it Sisit here, but it's the same thing. You have to wear a Sisit. Why are these two pisukim back to back? Must be significant. I mean, in general, when we have lists of laws, like in Devarim and other places, it actually is quite difficult to figure out why they're in that order that they are in. And so the rabbis look at it and say, well, it must be for very good reason. It's to compare and contrast them. And in this case, it would be telling us, yes, although on the one hand, you're not allowed to wear wool and linen together, but if you're making wool and linen together in order to prepare sisit, then it's permitted. If you have a linen garment and you want to put wool tassels on it, then it's good. You fulfill the mitzvah. This mitzvat aseh of wearing sisit is doche the lo ta'aseh of Shaatnez. And so we learn from the juxtaposition, semikhut, of these two pisukim, we learn this halacha, and we learn a general rule that in every case, lo ta'aseh, doche, lo ta'aseh. Very good. So here we are. Here's the answer. What's the source? I have a source. Sisit overrides Shaatnez. Okay, we're going to deal with this now. Number one, how do we know that semukhim works? How do you know that you can take two pisukim back to back and now derive something from it? Who said you can do something like that? In fact, there is a machloket whether you can do that only in Devarim. Rabbi Yehudah says only in Sefer Devarim when two pisukim are back to back. Luckily, this is in Sefer Devarim. Or the other rabbis say in all the books of the Chumash. Okay, so we're going to deal with that for a little while of how do we know the methodology of semukhim according to each opinion. And then we're going to come back to this very Sisit override Shaatnez law, and we're going to have multiple challenges to it. This is going to get a little confusing in the structure. It's just a lot of different challenges to that. Okay, so first of all, now we have an answer. We know positive overrides negative because Sisit overrides Shaatnez. But that assumes that you have a semukhim methodology. So, V'amar Elazar, semukhim min haTorah minayin. How do you know you can do learn something from two pisukim back to back? Shene'emar semukhim la'ad le'olam asuyim be'emet v'yashar. The mizmor in Tehillim that we say on mincha on Shabbat afternoons says that the Torah is semukhim, is juxtaposed forever and ever, made in truth and uprightness. So therefore, although he said semukhim from the Torah, the proof is not actually from the Torah, but from Tehillim. But nevertheless, it's referring to the whole Torah, which is purposely juxtaposed, and that's anyway one source. Furthermore, and now we're going to give another example of something that's of semikhut, and so this will be a further proof that we apply semikhut. Minayin leyevama shenafla lifle mukeshachin. The example happens to be about Yevama, so that's why we're doing some Yevamot today too. Don't worry for those who miss more Yevamot cases. So here's another one. Yevama that fell to her a mukeshachin. She was married to a nice, tall, handsome guy with clear skin, healthy, but he died somehow, and now she has to marry his brother. His brother happens to be afflicted with boils. He's disgusting. She can't even look at him. So are we going to force her to marry him and for him to do Yibbum? Let's say he wants to, and she doesn't want to. She's disgusted by him. Are we going to force her? So how do we know that she'en chosminota, that we don't muzzle her? Muzzle her would mean that we quiet her and don't listen to her objections. How do we know that we don't do that? Shene'emar lo tachsom shor b'disho usmich le ki yeshivu achim yachtav. The pesukim regarding Yevamot, regarding Yibbum, the whole law of Yibbum in 25:5 comes right after a pasuk that says one may not muzzle an ox while you are threshing. So don't muzzle that. Why is it back to back? Oh, semikhut, to teach you that if the woman objects, then we don't muzzle her. And we say, oh, you don't want to do Yibbum? All right, then sorry, buddy, you have to do chalitza because she's disgusted by your boils. All right, so you see here's another example where we learn an important law from semikhut. ואמר רב יוסף, אפילו למען דלה דריש semukhim בעלמא, במשנה תורה דריש. Rabbi Yehudah ba'alma la darish u'b'mishneh Torah darish. Rabbi Yosef is coming to add more support because he says, even according to the opinion, which is Rabbi Yehudah, who says we do not apply the methodology of semukhim in general. He doesn't like this methodology. He says, no, the Pesukim are in different order for whatever reason. It's not to teach you anything. But even Rabbi Yehudah would agree that in Mishneh Torah, Mishneh Torah is the way that the rabbis refer to Sefer Devarim, literally Deuteronomy. Deutero means second, nomos means Torah. So the English that we say today, Deuteronomy, comes from the Greek, which comes from a translation of Mishneh Torah. So it's actually the original, authentic name of the book. Sefer Devarim is a later name. So we should call it Mishneh Torah. So in Mishneh Torah, even he would, even Rabbi Yehudah, who in general does not learn things from juxtaposition of Pesukim, in Mishneh Torah he does. And luckily enough for us, both this Tarasha and the one about Sisit and Shaatnez are both in Devarim. So these are therefore good according to everybody. These are universally accepted Derashot, and so good. Now we know that we can use semikhut, and since we can use semikhut, therefore we can learn the law that a positive overrides a negative commandment, and that's what we needed in order to know why we need that original darasha of aleha. All right, now that we mentioned this interesting machloket about methodology, we're going to go into it further. Rabbi Yehudah, how come he does not apply the methodology of semikhut in other places? Tanya ben Azai Omer ne'emar mechashefa. Or how do you know that he doesn't? The Ben Azai explains. Mechashefa lo techayeh. Pasuk in Shemot says that a sorceress gets the death penalty. Ve'ne'emar kol shochev im behema mot yumat. And right after that, the next pasuk says that someone who commits bestiality also gets the death penalty. Why are they back to back? To teach you the punishment. It doesn't say a punishment about the sorceress, but it does say it's a punishment about bestiality is sikila, and so they are next to each other to teach you that that the sorceress is also stoned to death. Right? Otherwise, we wouldn't know what type of capital punishment she gets. So there you go. That's the Rabbanan who are applying semikhut in Sefer Shemot, where these pesukim are. Okay. Amar lo Rabbi Yehudah, v'chi mipnei shesamchu inyan lo no sees ze leskila. Rabbi Yehudah objects he doesn't object to the law, but he objects to the derivation. He says, just because there's two Pesukim together, now you're going to take this woman and stone her, right? That's not sufficient reason. You see, he doesn't accept semichut in Sefer Shemot, but he does agree with the law. He learns it from another place. Ela ov v'yideoni mechashefim hayu velama yasu lakish lahem velo madlach. Ma of v'yideoni biskila af mechashefa biskila. Okay, so where ov and yideoni are actually a subgroup, a category, a type of sorceress. And so they could have been just included. Why are they mentioned separately in Sefer Vayikra? Oh, it's so you could compare them. And just like Ovedeoni, I know that they get punishment by Sikila. So too, Mechashefa, a general sorceress, will also be Sikila. This is an application of a rule that you might know from the 13 rules of Rabbi Ishmael. That said, Davar shaya bichlal, v'yasa min hakelal lelamed, lo lelamed al asmo yasa, elamad al kelal kulo yasa. Right, something that could have been included in a generality. In this case, Ove Deoni, or one subspecies of sorceress. So it was in the general category, and yet it leaves the category. In other words, the Torah specifies it anyway to teach something, not to teach anything about itself, because we already know the punishment in Ovedeoni, but rather to teach about the whole generality that all people under the category of sorceress also get sikila. So Rabbi Yehudah says, I'm not learning this from juxtaposition, I'm learning it from this other rule. So he agrees it's sikila, but he doesn't apply semichut, because that's in Shemot, and he doesn't apply semichut unless it's in Sefer Devarim. All right, so now we now have a source that Rabbi Yehudah does not apply it and elsewhere. And how do you know that Rabbi Yehudah does apply semichut in Mishneh Torah, in Sefer Devarim? Ditnan, nose adam anusat aviv umfutat aviv, anusat beno umfutat beno. Rabbi Yehudah oser banusat aviv umfutat beno. So we know from this Mishnah here, where according to the Tanakh Kama, a person is allowed to marry the rape victim of his father, or someone who was seduced by his father, right? So therefore, if a person rapes or seduces a woman, that's not allowed. Okay, now the son says, oh, that victim, I want to marry her. Is he allowed? It's allowed. Of course, if it was his father's wife, it would not be allowed, even if it's not his mother. But in this case, they never married. There's no ishut. So there is never an application of adayot there. So therefore, even though his father was with her physically, it was no marital bond, and the child is therefore allowed to marry that rape victim. That's Tanakh Kama. Rabbi Yehudah oser banusat aviv umfutat aviv. Rabbi Yehudah says, no, you are not allowed to in that case. Now, what's the source of Rabbi Yehudah? Well, you can tell already. It's going to be a semichut case in Sefer Devarim. So let's see. Amadav Gidel Amadav. My tamad Rabbi Yehudah dichtiv lo yikach ish et eshet aviv. In Devarim it says a person may not take his father's wife, meaning even if it's not his mother. He marries, this means his stepmother. And then it adds words that are really not necessary. Velo yegale kenaf aviv. And he cannot uncover his father's corner, the corner of his clothing, which is some kind of euphemism. But what does this mean? It's coming to add some case. Kanaf shada'a aviv lo yegale. It means the kanaf here is referring to this woman who was the victim of rape or seduction that saw the father's nakedness. Now the son may not be with her. So that's what's coming to add. It's a case that's similar to a father's wife, except that he never married her. And so these extra words are coming to add that. And that's why Tanakh Kama says it's allowed. Rabbi Yehudah says, no, look at these extra words here that are back to back with the original law. Wait a second. And we might have saketiv. How do you know that's a very rape victim? You could be adding anything. So here, me'ilaveh dikra dichtiv natana isha shoche b'ma lavia nara 50 kasef usmichle lo yikach ish. Because look at the Pesukim right before that. And I brought them so you could see it. In Devarim 22, the last two Pesukim says, if a man comes upon a virgin who is not engaged and takes her and lies with her, and they are discovered, in other words, this is a case of utfasa, this is a case of rape, and then he has to pay the girl's father 50 shekel because he violated her and he cannot have the right to divorce her, and so on. So this is a case of a person taking by force, rape, seduction. And right after that, 23:1 says, ish et eshet aviv. Okay, I know what that case is, father's wife, but then it adds these extra words, aviv. What is that? Oh, it's semichut. Look, it's referring to the case that came right before it, and that's how Rabbi Yehudah, we see that he applies semichut and Sefer Devarim back to back, and that's why he prohibits it. All right, good. So now we know why Rabbi Yehudah does that. Wait a second, back on this case. How come the rabbis disagree? It looks like a really nice case of semichut, and the rabbis, Rabbanan, they apply semichut everywhere. So why don't they agree with this semichut and also prohibit the father's rape victim? Rabbis say, listen, if they were actually back to back directly, I would agree with you. Since they're not back to back, because you have these words in between, right? And so if you switch the order and this is lo yikach aviv first, fine, I would agree. But it doesn't say that, and therefore I do not learn semichut, although the rabbis agree that these are extra words. So what will we learn from these extra words? And the answer is a shomeret yavam. This would be a case where a person's uncle died without children, and his father is the yavam. So his father, therefore, has an obligation to take the yevamah. Before he actually does Yibbum, he's called a shomeret yavam. He's waiting. She is waiting for the yavam. She is called a shomeret yavam. If that's the son of the yavam, would go and be with this is his aunt, then he would violate this law of kenaf aviv. So in other words, the Torah is saying explicitly, don't take your father's wife and don't take your father's shomeret yavam, who he may do Yibbum and then be married to at any moment. Even if before they do Yibbum, there's already a zikah, a connection between them. And then if a person would do that, they would violate actually two levim. Number one, because this woman was his uncle's wife, and that's a prohibition by itself, right? A father's brother's wife is prohibited forever, even if he dies. And that's one violation. Second violation is because his father is the avam and therefore has a connection, almost married to her. So it's like the father's wife. And that's what the rabbis learn from it. They do not learn from this the case of a rape victim. All right. Now that we know the general rule of Rabbi Yehudah, that he applies semichut in Sefer Devarim and not in the rest of the laws, right? All this, by the way, is good, because what we were getting at originally was, how do you know that positive overrides a negative? This was from Sisit, good, and that was in Mishneh Torah. So no matter what, we're good. But now we're inquiring why. Mishneh Torah, my tama de darish. How come Rabbi Yehudah likes semichut in Mishneh Torah specifically? What's special about Mishneh Torah that he would apply semichut there? Two reasons. Reason number one is because all the examples in Sefer Devarim of semichut, it's evident that pasuk is out of place on purpose so that you could learn semichut. Right? It doesn't just happen to be so that's in Devarim, because really Devarim, as the name implies, Mishneh Torah is a repetition of the Torah. So kind of by definition, everything in Devarim, this is not really true, it's not everything, but a lot of subjects in Devarim were already talked about in the first 4 books of Chumash. And then the Sefadim is coming in saying it again. And in every one of those cases, you could say, why does Sefer Devarim choose to put this pasuk here when you could have had the same pasuk back in the first 4 books where the subject was first broached and where often it is spoken about at more length? And therefore, if it's in Sefer Devarim, that makes it evident that it was placed here, it moved here on purpose in order to be next to something else to teach you a law. So that's one reason. And second, because mufneh, meaning it's extra, that in all these cases in Devarim, there's some extra word or phrase that didn't need to be there, and that's telling you, hey, I'm highlighting, I'm extra. You know why? Look before or me or after me, and you'll see another law that I am next to teach something about that. Okay, now we're going to see.
Rabbi, can you make an inference or something? Doesn't a law that's in the first 4 books but doesn't show up in Devarim, looking at it the other way, is there an inference you can make for that way?
Oh, if it doesn't show up in Devarim, then you can't make any semikhut. There's nothing there to learn anything from.
At all, ever.
Right. The only question would be, let's say something is in Shemot and Vayikra. So then can you say, oh, look, it's not, how come it wasn't in Shemot? And how come it wasn't in Shemot and you repeat it in Vayikra? Would you say there also it's muchach or not? Right? That's what Rabbanan would say. Yes, you do that. It seems even the Yehudah would do semikhut if you can apply these 2 rules. If it's something that's evident, that's in the wrong place, and it's extra, then you can apply semikhut no matter where it is. It's just that he's saying that in Devarim, that's always the case. In the other books, case by case basis, right? Okay, let's see some examples, and this will be clear. And so back to this case of the father's rape victim. Why is this whole pasuk even here in Devarim at all? You could have put this back in back there. In other words, this pasuk here, right? Lo yikach ish et eshet aviv v'lo yigale kanaf aviv. If you put that back in Vayikra as another one of the list of arayot, it would fit perfectly well there. So this seems out. This is out of place on purpose to say, oh, listen, I want you to look before it. Right? So you could find some semikhut. So there you go. Right? And you could have had just the first set of pasuk, the rest of the pasuk about the corner of his garment. You don't need to write that at all. It doesn't add anything new to the father's wife case, and therefore it is both out of place and therefore evident and extra words. Good. So it works in that case. Shema mina, therefore it's extra. Let's apply these 2 rules to the Sisit case, the main one that we really need to teach that positive overrides negative. This case is both. Why do you have this pasuk here in Devarim that says Gidilim ta'aseh? Why is it here? We have Parashat Sisit and back in Sefer Bemidbar at the end of Parashat Shelach. So put it there, right, together with that one. It's out of place to say, I'm putting it here because I want it to be next to its friend, this friend here of Shaatnez. Good. aleha. לא תלבש שעטנז, למה לי? שמאמינה לאפנויה. So I could have just had the words ובגד כלאיים. This is here. לא תלבש שעטנז, סמר ופשתים יחדיו. This whole pasuk is extra, right? Because I already have back in Vayikra, I have another pasuk that says that a clothing that's kilayim is Shaatnez, and that it should not be upon you. We're going to learn a lot from this. Don't be upon you, which that already says it's not allowed, and it's even a broader term, right? It should not be upon you at all. So therefore, our pasuk, do not wear Shaatnez, is extra. And therefore, since it's extra, it comes to tell you that, oh, you can do a semikhut law and Devarim, and therefore the semikhut teaches us that the positive commandment of Sisit overrides the negative commandment against Shaatnez. Okay, good. So now we showed that the 2 rules apply, and the rest of it now is going to be challenging this semikhut derivation between Shaatnez and Sisit, because it only works if the words are extra, right? If these words Shaatnez are extra, if they are not extra, then they're needed for its place, and then you cannot do semichut, and then you cannot learn that aseh overrides lo ta'aseh, and if we don't have a derivation for that rule, aseh doche lo ta'aseh, then we wouldn't need the whole original derasha that we learned yesterday of aleha, because we would assume that a negative commandment of arayot overrides Yibbum anyway. So this is a key, right? Everything is built, the whole structure is built on having extra words in this case of Shaatnez. All right, we're going to be dealing with this for a while, so let's get tangled into the threads of this argument, so to speak. Okay, v'hai misrach serichi. These are actually necessary. If we had the pasuk in Vayikra that says it should not be upon you, I might have thought anything that's upon me is prohibited in Shaatnez. Even people who are selling garments. In those days, people who are selling garments would walk around with a whole bunch of shirts and suits on over their shoulder, peddling from door to door. And now let's say they are Shaatnez. Why are they selling Shaatnez? Whatever, I don't know. They're selling to non-Jews. So they're benefiting, whatever. They're selling Shaatnez, and it's draped over their shoulder, but they're not getting any benefit from it. So if I had only lo ya'aleh, I would say that's prohibited. It cannot be upon you in any way. Therefore, katav rachamana lo tilbash Shaatnez. That's why in Sefer Devarim it says, do not wear Shaatnez. Dum yad levishat behana'ah. Has to be similar to wearing, where you benefit from it. Only then is it prohibited. If you're just happens to be upon you because you're carrying it, then that's permitted. Okay, so say only right lo tilbash, don't wear it. If you only had Sefer Devarim, I would have thought only wearing it, totally wearing it, like around your arms and body, that is what's prohibited, because there's a lot of benefit when you're wearing it. But let's say it's just draped over your shoulder because it's providing you a little bit of heat. Sometimes you take a sweater and you don't wear the sweater, you just wrap it around over your shoulders. And so if I only had lo tilbash, I would say that's permitted when it's Shaatnez. That's why you have the other pasuk lo ya'aleh, that's also prohibited. And so the two together give you the compromise position. If you're just carrying it and getting no benefit, it's permitted to carry Shaatnez. But if you are either wearing it or draped over you with some benefit, then it's not allowed. That's why it says lo ya'aleh aleha. Okay, so that's why we need both pisukim there. So now, im ken lichtov rachamana lo tilbash Shaatnez semer ufishtim lamali. Okay, but still, part of the pasuk is extra, which is good. We need it to be extra because just for that it could have written lo tilbash Shaatnez. The words semer ufishtim are extra. So why do you need to tell me semer ufishtim? Mikadi ketav. How would I know? I mean, how would I know that it applies to wool and linen? Because it already says in Vayikra, beged kilaim Shaatnez lo ya'aleh aleha. So in Devarim it says wool and linen, but now we're saying those are extra words, because I would have known wool and linen just from Vayikra. Even though Vayikra doesn't mention wool and linen, it does say the word beged. And what is the definition of the word beged? ותנא דבר רבי ישמעאל, הואיל ונאמרו בתורה סתם בגדים, ופרט לך כתוב באחד מהם סמר ופשתים, אף כל סמר ופשתים. The Torah says beged in a lot of places, and in one of the places regarding leprosy, it specifies that it is made out of semer ufishtim. And from there we can learn that every time in the Torah it says the word beged, we can assume it's talking about wool and linen. Those are the main materials that clothing is made out of. So therefore here, when it says beged, simply, I would already know and assume it's talking about wool and linen, just from Vayikra. So therefore in Devarim, why do I need it to say this again? Oh, it's free, it's extra, and therefore I can use it for semichut, and everything's good. Okay, everything's good if we have extra words, because we need them for the semichut. But now we're not happy. Vakati isterich. But you know what? I'm going to prove that I need those words. And that's a problem. Salka datach amina hala'ahi de la nafish hana'ata, aval levisha de nafish hanayata, kol tiremine asar rachamana, katav rachamana semer ufishtim. I would have thought without those words that when I am just draping it over my shoulders, where I'm only getting a little bit of benefit, that is where it's only limited to wool and linen. But if I'm getting a lot of benefit, meaning if I'm wearing it, then maybe any garment made out of any material would be prohibited. And that's the pasuk in Devarim that says, Lo tilbash Shaatnez. If I ended the pasuk there, I would think all materials that you wear cannot be mixed together. Not even, silk and cotton would also be prohibited. And that's why I actually do need the word semer ufishtim in Devarim to teach me that even wearing is limited to wool and linen. And so this is a problem because now I need those words and they're not extra to do semichut. But we'll answer. Im ken lishtoker amine. No, even if you didn't have those words, the word Shaatnez appears in Devarim and in Vayikra, and I would have made a Gezerah Shava, just like in Vayikra. Shaatnez applies to Begadim, which is wool and linen, so too Shaatnez here applies also only to wool and linen, even if I'm wearing it. So now I'm good, and those two words are extra. Okay, challenge. V'tana debe Rabbi Ishmael. Tamad de katav rachamana semer ufishtim. Halav hachi kilayim b'sisit havamina da'asar rachamana. Hold on. According to Tana Rabbi Ishmael, we're going to see exactly what he says. You're telling me that the reason why the Torah says semer ufishtim is to teach me that I'm allowed to teach me the semichut, that I'm allowed to put Sisit, put Shaatnez in Sisit. All right, that Shaatnez is permitted Sisit, and it overrides. That's why it says these extra words. And so you're telling me that without this semichut derasha, then I would have thought that it's prohibited to have kilayim in Sisit. I'm going to show you that I would know that it overrides independently of the rule of positive overrides negative, independently of the semichut. I would know that you can have Shaatnez in Sisit. What's the derivation here? Pasuk, the parashat Sisit that we say every day says that you have to make Sisit on all of your garments. That is going to include the bigdei kohen. And the Tana Bishmael that we already cited says that bigadim, standard bigadim, means wool or linen. And the Torah just said that you have to make techelet. In other words, you have to make fringes. On the fringes, some of them have to be blue. And if you say blue fringes, blue thread is necessarily wool. How do you know? Amra means wool. Because look at the bigdei kohen. It mentions lots of different types of material, and one of them is shesh, which is linen, and that would mean that techelet is not linen because that's one of the materials. In other words, techelet is not only referring to the color but also to the type of material. And since the kohanim wear clothing that's made out of linen, and it requires sisit, and sisit have to be wool. Therefore, you're allowed to put wool on linen. That is Shaatnez, and it's permitted if it's sisit, for the mitzvah of sisit. And therefore, I would know independently that sisit overrides Shaatnez, and I don't need your derivation from semichut. And if I don't need that derivation, then I lose out on the whole aseh doche lo ta'aseh. All right, so this is a problem, but don't worry, we answer it. Isterich. In fact, I do need the derivation from semichut, and this would not be sufficient. Because I might have thought along the lines of the logic of Rava, even if we're not totally agreeing with Rava. What did he say? The Rava Rameh ketiv hakanaf min kanaf uchtiv semer upishtim. When the word says hakanaf in Parashat Sisit, Rava learned from that the sisit has to be the same material as the clothing, right? And so therefore, if it's wool, if it's silk, then the material has to be silk. And yet it also says, uchtiv semed ufishtim. So which one is it? Is it any of, it has to be the same material, or wool or linen? Hakesad, semed ufishtim, potzim ben biminan, ben shelo biminan. The answer is that wool and linen can be used as sisit for any material, whether it's the same material or any different material. That is the standard cloth. But other material like silk, if you have silk, you have to put silk fringes, and you cannot put anything else. Silk fringes can only be on silk, but not on a different type of material. So according to Rava, the word hakanaf teaches that you have to put the same material, the sisit has to be the same material as the garment. And so therefore, if I just had the word kanaf, then that's what I would assume. So Rava says, why do I need semed ufishtim? To teach me that wool and linen are the only materials that you can mix and match, and you can put wool on linen and linen on wool. So this is helpful to answer the question, because it shows that if I didn't have the word semed ufishtim, then all I would know is that you put the same one material on the other. I would think that wool sisit have to go on wool garment, and only linen sisit go on a linen garment. And this would obviate this, would answer this question, because the question of up here was that, hold on, I don't need semed ufishtim and your whole law of semikhut to teach me that you can override, because I would know that by myself. I would know that because the begadim of Kohen Gadol had linen and wool, because some of them are made out of linen, and I know the pasuk says you have to make techelet, and techelet is wool, so you're going to automatically have some wool on linen, and so I know it without. But here we say not necessarily. If you didn't have semed ufishtim, we might have agreed with Rava that you only put min b'mino, and that means on the wool garments, that's great. You can put the wool fringes with techelet. And I would think that on linen garments, you only put linen fringes, and you would have no dye. You would have no techelet on those. Like today, we have only white. Right? This is actually a good source, that the possibility that you can have sisit even without blue, right? And so you might think, therefore, that the linen garments would have only linen and no techelet, and so there actually would be no case of a need for shaatnez if you had only the sources of the clothing of the Kohen Gadol. And therefore, like Rava teaches, the word semed ufishtim comes and says you can put wool on linen, and therefore there does come up the requirement of shaatnez, but you would only know that you can override shaatnez in the case of sisit because I have the words semed ufishtim, which are juxtaposed to it. And that answers the question. Okay, this last part is simply a clarification. Hold on, Tana Rabbi Yishmael actually does not agree with Rava, because Rabbi Yishmael thinks that only begadim, only wool and linen require sisit. All other fabrics do not require sisit. This happens actually to be the halacha, that only wool and linen require sisit mideoraita. If you wear cotton, like most sisit are made out of, they would actually are required only midrabanan. So if you want to fulfill the mitzvah deoraita, make sure you have a beged that's made out of wool. Or linen. Good. So therefore, Rabbi Yishmael actually disagrees with Rava, because Rabbi Yishmael says you only put sisit on wool and linen. Rava says all material. So why are you bringing Rava into the situation here, since Rabbi Yishmael doesn't even agree with him? So here's what we mean to say: even though he doesn't agree, we still would have to argue along the same lines. I might have thought that I can make the same derivation, inference that Rava makes, that from the word hakanaf, min kanaf, that means only the same material, the sisit have to be in the same material as the garment. And then I could say this is what Torah means, so that woolen garments only get wool and linen garments only get linen. If it's a wool garment and you put wool fringes, then you can make them blue and have techelet. But if you're putting one on the other, then you would not have, then you cannot do it at all, because it has to be the same material. And if you put linen on linen, then you wouldn't have blue. So that's what I might have thought without the word semer ufishtim. So therefore, katav lachamana semer ufishtim, tafilu semer ufishtim, ufishtim lesemer, and that's why the pasuk has to go out of its way to add these extra words. That these words teach that I can put woolen fringes on linen and make them blue. And even though that would be a violation of Shaatnez, that's why those pasukim are right next to Shaatnez to tell me that wool and linen on linen or wool garment is permitted if you're attaching them for Sisit. And in the end, we uphold the semikhut. And from that semikhut, we learn that not only here does Sisit override Shaatnez, but in all cases, a positive will override the negative. And therefore, since I have that rule, theoretically, I would have said that the positive commandment of Yibbum would override the laws of Arayot. And that's why we need the derivation of aleha to teach me that here, that is not the case. Baruch Adonai L'olam. Amen ve'amen.